Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into a topic that's probably a little less glamorous than the knights in shining armor and damsels in distress you usually imagine. We're going to explore what intimacy, love, and just general human connection were really like in the medieval period. Picture this: you just spent a day trudging through a muddy, pig-infested village street, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale ale, and, well, let's just say, less pleasant things. Your teeth probably ache, if you even have all of them, and a persistent itch reminds you of the fleas that are your constant companions. Now, imagine trying to find romance, or even just a moment of peace, in that reality. Yeah, you probably won't survive it, not with your modern sensibilities intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing, or perhaps more accurately, squelching, in a medieval town. The streets aren't paved, of course. They're a chaotic mix of mud, animal droppings, and refuse tossed from windows above. The concept of sanitation as we know it simply doesn't exist. There are no public sewage systems, no regular trash collection, and definitely no widespread understanding of germ theory. So, every breath you take is a symphony of questionable odors. And let's not even get started on personal hygiene. Bathing was a rare and often communal event, more about social gathering than getting truly clean. Imagine sharing a tub, perhaps with a whole family, in water that's been used multiple times. Soap, when available, was harsh and abrasive. You'd be lucky to get a good scrub down a few times a year. This constant state of grubbiness wasn't just unpleasant, it was a fundamental part of life that shaped every interaction, including the most intimate ones. You're living in close quarters, often with entire families packed into small, dimly lit homes where privacy is an utterly foreign concept. The air inside is probably smoky from the cooking fire, and the straw on the floor is a perfect breeding ground for all sorts of creepy crawlies. This isn't the romanticized Middle Ages of Hollywood. This is a gritty, sensory overload where survival is the primary objective, and comfort is a distant dream. Historians still argue whether the general population was truly oblivious to the link between filth and disease, or if they simply lacked the means to do much about it. What we do know is that life expectancy was grimly short, and illnesses, from the common cold to the devastating bubonic plague, were ever-present threats. Think about it. How does the perpetual fear of disease, the constant itch of fleas, and the pervasive stench of a world without proper waste disposal affect your desire for closeness? It makes everything a bit challenging, to say the least. Your romantic notions of medieval knights wooing ladies would quickly evaporate when you consider the realities of their breath, their skin, and the general state of their garments, which were rarely, if ever, washed thoroughly. Forget about fresh linen. Think coarse wool, worn day in and day out, gathering grime and odors. This isn't to say people didn't experience desire or love, but the context in which these emotions blossomed was starkly different. You'd be living in a world where physical discomfort was the norm, where a lack of privacy was guaranteed, and where the constant threat of illness made even the simplest touch potentially fraught with danger. It really puts a damper on the happily ever after vibes, doesn't it? Every aspect of existence, including something as fundamental as human connection, was profoundly shaped by this pervasive lack of sanitation and the ever-present shadow of disease. You couldn't escape it. It was simply the air you breathed and the ground you walked on. So, you're navigating this unsanitary medieval world, and eventually, the topic of partnership arises. But hold on to your romantic comedies, because marriage in the Middle Ages was less about finding your soulmate and more about securing your family's future. Love, as we understand it today, that dizzying, butterflies in your stomach kind of love, was largely irrelevant. Instead, marriage was a meticulously calculated transaction. For the nobility, it was all about alliances, consolidating power, and expanding landholdings. A strategic marriage could elevate a family's status, end a feud, or secure political leverage. You, as a medieval noble, would likely have your spouse chosen for you, often when you were still a child, with the wedding taking place as soon as you reached a suitable age for procreation. There wasn't much room for personal preference in these high-stakes negotiations. It was a business merger, plain and simple, dressed up in a bit of ceremony. Even for commoners, the economics of marriage were paramount. A farmer might seek a wife who brought a good dowry, perhaps a few extra cows, some tools, or even a small plot of land, to improve his family's fortunes. A craftsman might look for a partner with skills that could contribute to the household economy, like weaving or brewing. And for women, marriage was often the only path to economic security and social standing. Unmarried women, particularly those without inherited wealth, faced a precarious existence. They might become domestic servants, work in the fields, or, in some cases, enter a convent. But these options rarely offered the same stability as a well-arranged marriage. So, while you might dream of sweeping someone off their feet, the reality was far more practical. You were marrying into a family, not just an individual, and the union's success was measured in progeny and prosperity, not passion. Historians still argue whether instances of genuine affection within arranged marriages were common or merely anecdotal. While some couples undoubtedly grew to love each other over time, the initial impetus was rarely personal desire. Think about it. Imagine meeting your spouse on your wedding day. Or perhaps having seen him only a handful of times before, all under the watchful eyes of your respective families. The pressure to produce heirs, especially male ones, was immense. Your primary duty as a wife was to bear children, and as a husband, to provide for them. There wasn't a concept of a honeymoon phase in the modern sense. Instead, there was often an immediate expectation of consummation to cement the union and begin the process of procreation. It sounds less like a romantic adventure and more like a very serious job interview with lifelong implications. Doesn't it? The concept of marriage as a romantic ideal, where two people freely choose each other based on mutual affection, is a relatively modern invention. In the medieval world, you were a cog in a larger societal machine, and your marriage was one of the most important gears, ensuring the machine kept turning. This pervasive practicality extended to almost every aspect of marital life. Discussions about sex within marriage would have been functional, focused on procreation, rather than pleasure, while the Church later began to acknowledge the role of pleasure within marriage. Its primary emphasis remained firmly on the begetting of children. Your marital bed was, first and foremost, a procreation station. Any enjoyment derived was a fortunate side effect, not the main event. So, when you think of medieval love stories, remember they were often woven from threads of duty, necessity, and occasionally, a quiet, growing affection born of shared hardship, rather than the explosive, passionate romance we often crave today, with marriage firmly established as a practical contract rather than a love match. The medieval Church stepped in, wielding immense power over every aspect of life, especially anything even vaguely related to desire and the body. Their grip on sexual morality was ironclad, dictating what was permissible, when it was permissible, and with whom. Forget spontaneity. Your intimate life was under intense scrutiny, guided by doctrines that often bordered on the bizarre by modern standards. The primary purpose of sex, according to the Church, was procreation. Any act that deviated from this goal, or wasn't performed within the confines of a legally sanctioned marriage, was considered a sin. And sins, in this era, weren't just abstract concepts. They could lead to very real, very unpleasant consequences, both in this life and the next. Think about the sheer number of forbidden acts. Sex on Sundays and feast days. Forbidden. During Lent or Advent. Absolutely not. During pregnancy or menstruation. Definitely out. With your spouse for pleasure alone, without the intent to procreate. Technically, a venial sin, a lesser transgression, but still something to confess. The church even had strong opinions on positions, with anything other than the missionary position often being viewed with suspicion, as it was considered less conducive to procreation and potentially too pleasurable. It's like a medieval rulebook for, well, everything, including your bedroom activities. You'd probably need a flowchart just to figure out when you were allowed to, do the deed without risking eternal damnation. It makes you wonder how anyone managed to have children at all with all those restrictions. Doesn't it? Confession was a powerful tool in enforcing these rules. You were expected to confess your sins, including those of the flesh, to a priest. This act not only offered absolution but also reinforced the church's authority and provided a mechanism for social control. Imagine detailing your intimate transgressions to a celibate priest, who then might prescribe a penance, perhaps prayers, fasting, or even public humiliation, depending on the severity of the perceived sin. This constant oversight meant that personal desire was often intertwined with fear of divine punishment and social ostracism. Historians still argue whether the common people genuinely adhered to these strictures or found ways to circumvent them discreetly. While the official church doctrine was clear, human nature, then as now, had a funny way of finding its own paths. For instance, the concept of spiritual marriage, or chaste relationships existed, especially among devout couples who sought to elevate their union beyond the physical. But for the vast majority, the pressure to conform was immense. Adultery, for example, was a grave sin, often punished severely in both secular and ecclesiastical courts. For women, the consequences were particularly dire, potentially leading to social ruin, disinheritance, or even violence. For men, while still a sin, the societal repercussions were often less severe, highlighting the pervasive gender inequality of the time. This wasn't just about personal morality, it was about maintaining social order, lineage, and the very fabric of medieval society. The Church, in its infinite wisdom, sought to control the unruly forces of human desire, shaping not only individual lives but the entire cultural landscape of the era. It was a world where every flicker of desire was scrutinized, every act weighed against a divine ledger, and where the threat of eternal damnation loomed large over even the most private moments. While the church was busy laying down rules for your bedroom, another, seemingly contradictory, ideal was taking hold, at least in the upper echelons of society: courtly love. Now, this isn't about passion within marriage, quite the opposite. Courtly love was an elaborate, highly ritualized game, often played out between a knight and a married noblewoman, and it was almost entirely unconsummated. Think of it as the medieval version of a celebrity crush, but with more poetry, secret glances, and ridiculously elaborate displays of devotion. The knight would idealize his lady, serving her with unwavering loyalty and performing brave deeds in her name, all to win a smile, a favor, or perhaps a glove. This wasn't about physical intimacy, it was about spiritual and emotional refinement. The knight's love was meant to make him a better person, more chivalrous, more honorable. It was an exercise in self-improvement through unrequited desire. The lady, in turn, was often portrayed as unattainable, a lofty ideal who inspired the knight to greatness. It's a concept that sounds utterly exhausting, isn't it? Imagine performing heroic feats and writing sonnets, all for a love that you knew, deep down, could never truly be yours. It's like being perpetually stuck in the friend zone, but with added jousting. The origins of courtly love are debated among historians, with some tracing it back to troubadour poetry in southern France, while others see it as a literary construct that barely touched real life. Regardless, it certainly provided a fascinating contrast to the grim practicality of arranged marriages and the church's strictures. For noble women, it offered a rare avenue for intellectual and emotional engagement outside the confines of their marital duties, providing a sense of agency, however symbolic. For knights, it was a way to channel their martial prowess into something supposedly more refined, a sublimation of baser urges into noble deeds. It's quite the psychological balancing act, trying to embody both the pious, procreating spouse and the ardently devoted, chaste lover. You'd encounter tales of courtly love in epic poems and romances. Stories that painted a picture of idealized affection far removed from the muddy realities of medieval life. Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde, these were the archetypes. But how much did these literary fantasies actually influence the average person? Probably not much beyond the very elite who had the leisure and literacy to consume such tales. For the vast majority, daily struggles left little time for such elaborate romantic games. Yet, the concept itself is a mainstream historical fact, illustrating a fascinating tension in medieval society: the stark contrast between the physical, procreative purpose of marriage and the ethereal, often non-physical, ideals of courtly devotion. Historians still argue whether courtly love was a genuine social phenomenon or primarily a literary convention designed to entertain and instruct. It was, in many ways, an escape, a fantasy woven from silken threads of longing in a world otherwise dominated by rough wool and harsh reality. So, you're in this medieval world, navigating arranged marriages and strict church rules. And suddenly, you're faced with the very real prospect of children. But what if you don't want them? Or at least not right now. Forget your modern birth control pills and condoms. In the Middle Ages, contraception was a desperate, often dangerous, and almost always ineffective endeavor. People tried everything, from herbal concoctions to bizarre magical rituals, often rooted in superstition rather than any scientific understanding of the body. You'd hear whispers of remedies passed down through generations, often concocted by local wise women or midwives, who were themselves walking a fine line between healer and suspected witch. One of the more common, though utterly useless, methods involved consuming various herbs or potions. We're talking about things like pennyroyal, savin, or rue, often taken in doses that were more likely to cause severe illness or miscarriage, which was also considered a grave sin, than actually prevent conception safely. Some believed that drinking water used to wash the genitals of a pregnant woman would prevent pregnancy, or that wearing certain amulets, perhaps a weasel testicle, if you were feeling particularly adventurous, would ward off conception. It's enough to make you shake your head and marvel at the sheer desperation. Isn't it? The sheer lack of effective knowledge meant that people were grasping at straws, trying anything to gain some control over their fertility in a world where unwanted pregnancies could mean ruin. Another quirky tidbit involves ancient beliefs about the timing of intercourse. Some thought that having sex during a woman's cold period, i.e. not ovulating, though they didn't understand the science, was less likely to result in conception. Or that certain positions, less conducive to seed retention, might work. It's almost comical how far off the mark these theories were, given what we know now about human biology. But for medieval people, these were serious attempts to manage a fundamental aspect of their lives with the limited knowledge available. The success rate, as you might imagine, was incredibly low, leading to large families and the constant cycle of pregnancy and childbirth. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of these methods points to a defiant streak against church doctrine, or simply a pragmatic attempt to manage family size in difficult economic circumstances. The church explicitly condemned contraception, viewing it as interfering with God's will and the natural purpose of procreation. Yet, the evidence suggests that people, especially women, continued to seek ways to control their fertility, sometimes at great personal risk. You can imagine the immense pressure to have children, but also the equally immense burden of having too many mouths to feed in a subsistence economy. So, you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, the risk of eternal damnation versus the very real struggles of poverty and too many hungry children. It's a stark reminder that while the grand narratives of kings and castles dominate history, the daily lives of ordinary people were often defined by much more fundamental and desperate struggles. The drive to manage one's own body, even without the proper tools, is a deeply human one that transcended the rigid moral codes of the time. Speaking of children, once you did get pregnant in the Middle Ages, and given the lack of effective contraception. This was highly likely. You entered a period of intense peril. Pregnancy and childbirth were not just a natural part of life, they were a leading cause of death for women. You wouldn't survive it without immense luck. Imagine enduring 9 months with little to no medical understanding of what was happening inside your body. There were no prenatal vitamins, no regular checkups, and certainly no ultrasounds to reassure you. Instead, you'd rely on traditional remedies, superstitious beliefs, and the wisdom of local midwives, who were often the only medical professionals women had access to. Particularly in rural areas, the signs of pregnancy were often interpreted through folk wisdom. A missed period, morning sickness, these were known. But beyond that, understanding was rudimentary. A quirky tidbit is the belief that a woman's temperament during pregnancy could influence the child's personality. If you were cheerful, your baby would be too. If you were melancholy, expect a moody offspring. It placed an additional, unnecessary burden on expectant mothers, didn't it? As if growing a human inside you wasn't enough. You also had to manage your emotions for the sake of the baby's future disposition. When the time came for labor, it was an incredibly dangerous ordeal. Childbirth usually took place at home, in often unsanitary conditions, with only female attendants, family members, neighbors, and the aforementioned midwife. There was no pain relief beyond perhaps a prayer or a desperate swig of alcohol. Complications that we now consider routine, like a breech birth, prolonged labor, or postpartum hemorrhage, were often fatal. Maternal mortality rates were staggeringly high. It's difficult to give an exact number, but some estimates suggest that as many as 1 in 5 pregnancies could result in the death of the mother, or even higher in some regions or during times of famine and disease. This grim reality meant that every birth was a gamble, a life and death struggle for both mother and child. And if you survived childbirth, the infant mortality rates were equally horrifying. A significant percentage of babies wouldn't live past their first year, succumbing to childhood diseases, malnutrition, or exposure. Historians still argue about the emotional impact of such high mortality rates on medieval parents. Did they detach themselves emotionally to cope with the constant loss? Or did they grieve just as deeply as we do today? Despite the frequency of death, it's a somber thought, but the omnipresent specter of death for both mother and child profoundly shaped medieval family life and attitudes towards procreation. The act of bringing a new life into the world was not a joyful celebration in the way we often imagine it today. It was a testament to endurance, a battle against overwhelming odds, and a constant reminder of the fragility of human existence. You would be entering into this terrifying lottery every time you became pregnant, hoping against hope that you and your child would be among the lucky few to survive. Given the Church's stringent rules and the pragmatic realities of medieval life, it's no surprise that anything deviating from sanctioned, procreative, heterosexual intercourse within marriage was deemed sexual deviance, and often met with severe punishment. You were living in a society where morality was inextricably linked to religious doctrine, and transgressions of the flesh were seen not just as personal failings, but as offenses against God and the entire community. This meant that practices considered commonplace or even celebrated today were utterly condemned, leading to hidden lives and profound fear for many. Adultery, for instance, was a grave sin and a social crime. For a woman, the consequences could be ruinous, leading to public shaming, ostracization, and even physical violence or death, depending on local customs and the social status of those involved. For a man, while still condemned, the penalties were often less severe, highlighting the pervasive gender double standard. You might face fines, public penance, or even temporary exile, but rarely the same level of social destruction as a woman. This stark difference in treatment is a mainstream historical fact, illustrating the patriarchal nature of medieval society. Then there was fornication, sex outside of marriage, even between unmarried consenting adults. While perhaps not as severely punished as adultery or other unnatural acts, It was still a sin and could lead to social disapproval, especially for women, and the birth of illegitimate children, who faced a challenging existence with fewer rights and opportunities. Imagine the pressure to marry quickly if you found yourself in such a predicament. A particularly quirky tidbit is the concept of spiritual fornication, or spiritual incest, where certain relationships, even non-physical ones, were deemed sinful if they mirrored forbidden familial bonds in a spiritual sense, such as between a godparent and the godchild. This demonstrates the extent to which the Church sought to regulate not just physical acts but also the complex web of social and spiritual relationships. It's like they had a rule for absolutely everything, even things you didn't think could have rules. But the harshest punishments were reserved for what was considered sodomy, or unnatural acts. This broad category encompassed everything from bestiality to masturbation, and most notably, homosexual acts. Such practices were viewed as abominations, violations of divine law, and a threat to the natural order. The penalties were often extreme, including public burning, castration, or other forms of mutilation and execution. While historical records of homosexual behavior exist, they are often couched in terms of condemnation and punishment, forcing those who engaged in such relationships to live in profound secrecy and fear. Historians still argue about the prevalence of these so-called deviant behaviors and the extent to which they were truly persecuted versus simply preached against. What is clear is that medieval society, heavily influenced by religious dogma, left little room for sexual expression that diverged from the narrow path of procreative marital intimacy. You wouldn't survive it if you openly expressed desires outside the prescribed norms. The social and legal machinery was designed to crush such individuality. Despite the Church's vehement condemnations of any non-procreative sex, and the severe punishments for sexual deviance, another truth existed in medieval towns: prostitution. It was, in many ways, a necessary evil, tolerated and even regulated in some areas, highlighting a stark contradiction between official morality and practical societal needs. You wouldn't find it openly celebrated, but you'd definitely find it. In many urban centers, civic authorities recognized that if they didn't provide an outlet for male sexual desire, it would simply spill over into less controlled and potentially more disruptive forms, such as rape or seduction of respectable women. So, while still considered sinful by the Church, prostitution often operated in designated areas, sometimes called stews, or brothels, often located outside the city walls or in specific districts. These establishments were sometimes even licensed and taxed by municipal authorities, providing a source of revenue and a degree of control. Imagine a medieval city council debating the pros and cons of regulated vice. It sounds almost modern, doesn't it? The women who worked in these establishments, often referred to as common women, or women of the street, were, however, at the very bottom of the social hierarchy, living precarious lives marked by poverty, disease, and social stigma. They had few rights and were often subject to exploitation. A mainstream historical fact is that cities like London, Paris, and Venice had well-known red light districts with officially sanctioned brothels. The famous Bankside stews in London, for instance, were under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Winchester, which is a rather quirky tidbit, isn't it? The very same institution that condemned illicit sex was, in a roundabout way, profiting from it. This practical tolerance, despite moral outrage, is a fascinating example of medieval pragmatism overriding pure theological doctrine. It reveals a society struggling to reconcile its ideals with the messy realities of human nature. You might be wondering about the conditions in these brothels. They were likely not luxurious, often cramped, unsanitary, and dangerous. Diseases, particularly sexually transmitted infections, though not understood as such at the time, were rampant, adding another layer of peril to an already difficult life. These women faced not only social ostracization but also constant health risks, often dying young. Historians still argue about the extent to which these women were forced into prostitution versus choosing it as a last resort for survival. while direct coercion certainly occurred. For many, it was the only viable option in a world with limited economic opportunities for women, especially those without family support or dowries. So, while you were being told that sex was only for procreation within marriage, the medieval world quietly, or sometimes not so quietly, acknowledged that certain human desires needed an outlet. Prostitution served as that highly regulated, yet morally condemned, outlet, creating a strange paradox in the heart of deeply religious communities. It was a clear demonstration that even in the most dogmatic of times, society often finds a way to accommodate the undesirable aspects of human nature, albeit often at great cost to those involved. As we've seen, medieval society was incredibly rigid in its sexual morality, especially concerning anything that veered from the heterosexual, procreative norm. This brings us to a difficult but important topic: homosexuality. While often unacknowledged or fiercely condemned, same-sex relationships and desires certainly existed in the Middle Ages, forcing those who experienced them to live deeply hidden lives under constant threat of persecution. You wouldn't survive openly expressing these orientations. The consequences were too severe. The Church considered homosexual acts to be sodomy, an unnatural vice, and one of the gravest sins, often linked with heresy and deserving of the harshest penalties, including execution by burning. This mainstream historical fact created an atmosphere of profound fear and secrecy for anyone whose desires strayed from the prescribed path. Imagine the internal conflict, the isolation, and the sheer terror of living in a society where your very nature could lead to a horrific death if discovered. Public records, when they exist, usually describe accusations and punishments rather than intimate details of relationships, making it challenging for modern historians to fully understand the lives of LGBTQ+ individuals in this period. However, a quirky tidbit is that despite the official condemnation, some historical sources suggest the existence of same-sex affections and relationships, particularly in environments where men or women lived in close quarters, such as monasteries, convents, or military camps. Sometimes these relationships might have been platonic, based on deep friendship and spiritual bonds, but others undoubtedly contained romantic or sexual elements, albeit discreetly. Poetry and literature, particularly from the early medieval period, occasionally hint at such bonds, though always with a layer of ambiguity to avoid direct accusation. It's like finding tiny clues in a massive historical puzzle, glimpses of lives lived entirely in the shadows. Historians still argue about the prevalence of homosexual acts and identities in the Middle Ages. Was it a widespread phenomenon forced underground? Or were instances truly rare due to effective societal repression? The difficulty lies in the silence of the historical record. People who engaged in such relationships had every incentive to conceal them, leaving little evidence for us to examine today. We can infer their existence through legal condemnations, penitentials, handbooks for confessors listing sins and their penances, and rare, often condemnatory, literary references. You have to remember that the concept of a distinct, homosexual identity, as we understand it today, a fixed orientation, didn't really exist in the medieval mind. Instead, acts were condemned as sinful. A man who engaged in sex with another man wasn't necessarily labeled a homosexual, but rather someone who committed the sin of sodomy. This distinction, while subtle, is important for understanding the medieval mindset. It allowed for the possibility of repentance and a return to correct behavior, rather than labeling someone as inherently flawed. But this distinction offered little comfort to those living in fear, for whom exposure meant a very real and often brutal end. Their lives, loves, and desires were forced into the darkest corners, a stark reminder of the crushing power of religious and societal intolerance in the medieval world. So, we've talked about the pervasive filth of medieval streets and homes. And this leads us directly to perhaps the most impactful reality shaping intimacy: personal hygiene. Or rather, the distinct lack thereof. Forget your daily showers, your scented soaps, your toothbrushes. In the Middle Ages, Bathing was a rare luxury, and personal cleanliness was a concept far removed from our modern standards. You wouldn't survive it without developing an incredible tolerance for, well, everything. Let's start with bathing. For most common people, a full body wash was an infrequent event, perhaps a few times a year, often in communal bathhouses in larger towns, or in a shared wooden tub at home. The water would be heated over a fire, a laborious process, and often reused by multiple family members. Imagine the water after the third or fourth person has taken their turn. Not exactly a spa experience, is it? For the wealthy, private baths existed, but even then, bathing wasn't a daily ritual. It was more about soaking away aches and pains, or for social interaction, than truly scrubbing away grime. This mainstream historical fact meant that bodies, even those of the elite, would have carried a persistent array of odors that we would find quite startling today. Oral hygiene was practically non-existent. You might try rubbing your teeth with a rough cloth or some abrasive herbs. But tooth decay and gum disease were rampant. Imagine trying to have an intimate moment with someone whose breath was consistently, shall we say, robust, and whose teeth were likely decaying or missing entirely. It certainly adds a layer of practical challenge to any romantic notions. Hair care was also minimal. Lice were a constant companion for everyone. Regardless of social standing, regular washing was uncommon, leading to greasy, often matted hair that would be periodically picked clean of its tiny inhabitants. It makes you grateful for modern shampoo, doesn't it? A quirky tidbit is that people often used strong perfumes and sachets of dried herbs to try and mask body odors. Rather than removing them, you might see nobles carrying pomanders, ornate balls filled with aromatic substances, or stuffing their clothing with sweet-smelling herbs. It was a valiant, though often losing, battle against the pervasive stench. This reliance on masking rather than cleaning tells you a lot about the priorities and limitations of the time. Historians still argue whether medieval people simply had a higher tolerance for bodily smells, or if they were as bothered as we would be but simply lacked the means to effectively combat them. It's hard to imagine anyone genuinely enjoying being close to someone in that state. But perhaps it was simply the accepted norm. This constant state of uncleanliness impacted every aspect of life, from social interactions to, crucially, intimate ones. The sensory experience of closeness would have been vastly different from today. Touch, smell, even taste would have been filtered through a pervasive layer of grime, sweat, and the various odors of a pre-sanitation world. It's a stark reminder that our perception of romance and intimacy is heavily influenced by our modern standards of hygiene. In medieval times, you would have to redefine what clean meant, and probably just accept that everyone smelled a bit like a medieval person. And that, dear listener, is a smell you definitely wouldn't survive. Given the reality of medieval hygiene, it's perhaps unsurprising that medieval fashion focused heavily on concealment. Layers, layers, and more layers were the order of the day, not just for warmth, but also, one might infer, to create a barrier between the body and the outside world, and perhaps even to mask some of those lingering aromas we just discussed. You wouldn't find much skin on display, and this profoundly shaped how bodies were perceived, desired, and kept private. For both men and women, clothing was largely functional, made from wool, linen, or sometimes silk for the very wealthy. Women's attire involved long gowns, often with multiple underlayers, high necklines, and long sleeves that covered almost every inch of skin. Veils or wimples covered their hair and often framed their faces tightly. It's a far cry from modern fashion that often emphasizes curves or reveals skin. In the medieval era, the female form was almost entirely obscured, save for perhaps the face and hands. The silhouette was long and flowing, designed to emphasize modesty and decorum. Men's fashion, while less restrictive, also favored layers. Tunics, hose, and cloaks were standard, while some working men might shed a layer or two for manual labor. The general trend, especially among the upper classes, was towards modest and concealing attire. The idea was to present a dignified, often idealized, version of the self, rather than to highlight physical attributes. This mainstream historical fact meant that the body, particularly the sexual body, was largely kept out of public view and conversation. A quirky tidbit is how fashion, despite its modesty, could still convey status and wealth. The richness of the fabric, the intricacy of embroidery, and the dyes used were all indicators of one's social standing. So, while you couldn't show off your biceps or your cleavage, you could certainly impress with your silk and ermine. It's like a medieval version of stealth wealth, where the expense was in the quality and quantity of the material, not the daringness of the cut. Historians still argue whether this extreme modesty was purely a reflection of religious doctrine, emphasizing the sinfulness of the flesh, or also a practical response to the cold climates and lack of proper heating in medieval homes. Probably a bit of both. Knowing the Middle Ages, the pervasive cultural message was that the body, especially the female body, was a source of temptation and therefore needed to be carefully covered and controlled. This cultural emphasis on concealment meant that any glimpse of skin, or even the suggestion of a body beneath the layers, would have been far more provocative than it would be today. Imagine the excitement over an exposed ankle. It's almost comical to think about now. But in a world where so little was revealed, even the smallest hint could carry immense power. This heavily layered approach to clothing shaped not only how people dressed but also how they thought about the body, desire, and privacy, making intimacy an even more private and perhaps even more forbidden act. So, you're layered up, navigating the murky streets, and enduring the strict moral codes. But fear not, for even in the rigidly structured medieval world, there were moments of release and revelry, feasts and festivals. These were the times when the usual constraints loosened, when the ale flowed more freely, and when social interactions, including those leaning towards the amorous, could become a little less inhibited. You wouldn't find outright debauchery in the streets, but you'd certainly see a shift in the atmosphere. These were significant events, marking religious holidays, seasonal changes, or important civic occasions. Think about the sheer anticipation building up to a medieval fair or a major Saints' Day celebration. For most people, life was monotonous and arduous, so these festivals were a vital escape, a chance to eat better food, drink more generously, and engage in merriment. Music, dancing, storytelling, and communal games were central to these gatherings. It was a time when the boundaries between social classes might blur ever so slightly, and when people from different villages or towns would come together. A mainstream historical fact is that during these festivals, courtship rituals, though still formal, became more pronounced. Young men and women, who might otherwise have limited opportunities for interaction, could exchange glances, share a dance, or engage in flirtatious banter under the watchful, but slightly more lenient, eyes of their elders. The atmosphere of collective celebration often created a sense of heightened emotion and reduced inhibition, leading to more overt displays of affection than would be acceptable in daily life. It's like the medieval equivalent of a college party, but with more mead and less self-awareness. A quirky tidbit is the role of certain traditions, like the Lord of Misrule during Christmas or the Maypole dances in spring. These rituals often inverted social norms, allowing for temporary chaos and even mild transgression, which subtly created an environment where romantic pursuits might be less judged. People would dress up, sing bawdy songs, and participate in games that brought them into closer physical contact. It was a controlled release valve for societal pressures, including those around intimacy. Historians still argue whether these periods of licensed revelry truly led to more illicit sexual encounters or simply allowed for more open expression of attraction within existing boundaries. It's hard to tell from the historical record, as people weren't exactly documenting their drunken flirting for posterity. However, it's safe to say that the relaxed atmosphere, combined with copious amounts of alcohol, likely lowered inhibitions. Imagine a group of tired peasants, after months of hard labor, finally getting a chance to let loose. The air would be filled with laughter, singing, and the general clamor of a good time. physical touch, otherwise reserved or purely functional, might become more frequent and playful. While these festivals rarely descended into complete anarchy, they certainly provided a stark contrast to the rigid morality of everyday medieval life, offering brief, intoxicating glimpses of a world where desire could be expressed, even if only fleetingly, and without the immediate threat of fire and brimstone. You wouldn't want to miss them, not if you hoped for any semblance of fun in your medieval existence. Beyond the social and religious constraints, your very understanding of your own body, and thus the act of sex, in the Middle Ages was profoundly different from today. Medicine and anatomy were rudimentary at best, a strange blend of ancient Greek theories, folk remedies, and often, outright superstition. You wouldn't survive it if you expected anything resembling modern medical insight. Forget knowing how things really worked, your body was a mystery, and often, a source of fear. The prevailing medical theory was that four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, illness was believed to be an imbalance of these humors, and treatments involved trying to restore that balance through bleeding, purging, or changes in diet. The idea that specific organs had specific functions in the way we understand them was largely absent. So, when it came to understanding reproduction, the theories were often imaginative. For instance, it was widely believed that both men and women produced seed, and that both had to reach orgasm for conception to occur. This quirky tidbit, while scientifically inaccurate, ironically gave women a theoretical parity in the act of procreation that later eras would deny them. It also implied that if a couple was trying to conceive, the woman's pleasure was, in a way, a necessary component. Actual knowledge of internal anatomy was limited, primarily derived from animal dissections. Human dissection was generally forbidden for religious reasons, or observations of injuries and surgical procedures on the battlefield. This mainstream historical fact meant that doctors and healers operated with very little understanding of the complex biological processes of the human body. Childbirth, for example, was managed based on observed tradition and experience, not on a detailed understanding of the female reproductive system. It's truly astonishing how people manage to survive, let alone reproduce, with such a limited medical toolkit. Treatments for sexual ailments or infertility were often bizarre and ineffective. For impotence, you might be advised to consume ground animal parts, specific herbs, or even engage in magical rituals. For infertility, women might be prescribed potions made from various animal organs or told to wear particular amulets. Imagine consulting a medieval doctor for a fertility issue. The advice you'd receive would likely be a combination of prayers, strange concoctions, and perhaps a lecture on your moral failings. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of such cures reflects genuine belief in their efficacy or a desperate clinging to any hope in the face of insurmountable medical challenges. Perhaps it was a bit of both. People wanted to believe that something could be done, even if the evidence was scarce. This lack of scientific understanding meant that the physical act of sex itself was framed not by biological processes but by moral and spiritual implications. Pleasure was viewed with suspicion, often as a potential gateway to sin, rather than a natural biological function. Diseases were seen as divine punishment, and physical conditions were often attributed to spiritual failings. Your body was not a marvel of biological engineering but a vessel, susceptible to external forces and moral weaknesses. It made for a very different, and often terrifying, experience of one's own physicality, especially when it came to the mysterious and powerful acts of intimacy and procreation. Building on the medical ignorance, the constant threat of disease profoundly impacted all aspects of medieval life, and by extension, the capacity for and perception of intimacy. You lived in a world where illness wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a common, often fatal, part of existence. This constant shadow of sickness shaped everything, including how you related to other bodies, particularly in a period where the true causes of disease were utterly unknown. You wouldn't survive it if you carried your modern aversion to germs and illness. Think about the devastating impact of plagues. The Black Death, a mainstream historical fact, wiped out an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population in the mid-14th century. Imagine the psychological toll of living through such an event. Every cough, every fever, every new bump on the body could signal the onset of a horrifying, swift death. This pervasive fear of contagion would undoubtedly affect willingness for physical closeness. Why risk contracting a potentially fatal illness just for a fleeting moment of intimacy? Social distancing, though not called that, would have become a grim necessity. Families and communities were ravaged, and the sheer scale of death would have desensitized many, yet simultaneously heightened the fear of the physical body as a carrier of death. Beyond the major plagues, common illnesses like dysentery, smallpox, tuberculosis, and various fevers were endemic. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, and very little effective treatment beyond prayer or folk remedies. Life expectancy was short, and most people would have experienced significant illness multiple times in their lives. This meant bodies were often scarred, weakened, or disfigured by disease. A quirky tidbit is that some penitentials, confessors' handbooks, even included questions about sexual acts performed while one partner was ill, indicating that even in sickness, the church still had rules. It's like, are you sure you can't just wait until they're feeling better? Historians still argue about the long-term psychological effects of living in such a disease-ridden environment. Did it make people more fatalistic, less attached to individual lives, knowing they could be taken at any moment? Or did it, paradoxically, make them cling to life and each other more fiercely, cherishing fleeting moments of connection? It's hard to say definitively. What is certain is that the constant presence of illness affected physical desirability, energy levels, and the very act of procreation. A sick body was less appealing, less capable, and often, less fertile. Moreover, the lack of understanding about how diseases spread meant that people might unknowingly engage in practices that exacerbated outbreaks. The very acts of care and comfort, holding a feverish loved one, sharing a bed, or a meal, could inadvertently spread contagion. This grim reality meant that intimacy, whether marital or otherwise, always carried an implicit risk, a dance with the unknown forces of sickness and death. It fundamentally altered the landscape of desire, making every physical interaction a reminder of human fragility and the ever-present, invisible enemies that lurked in the very air you breathed. You would learn to navigate life with a constant awareness of illness, and that awareness would inevitably color every decision, including those related to closeness. So, you've journeyed through a medieval world of pervasive filth, arranged marriages, strict religious dogma, desperate contraception, perilous childbirth, hidden desires, and constant disease. It all sounds rather grim and unromantic, doesn't it? You wouldn't survive it, not with your expectation of comfort and privacy. Yet, despite all these hardships, the medieval period, in its strange and often brutal way, laid some surprising groundwork for our modern understanding of love and relationships. Its enduring legacy echoes in concepts we often take for granted today. Consider, for instance, the influence of courtly love. While often unconsummated and highly stylized, it introduced the radical notion that romantic love, distinct from mere procreation or social alliance, was a worthy pursuit in itself. This mainstream historical fact, though initially limited to the elite, slowly filtered down through literature and song, contributing to the eventual idealization of romantic partnership that blossomed in later centuries. Before courtly love, marriage was primarily economic. Afterward, the seed of emotional connection, however abstract, began to be sown. It's almost ironic how a concept so divorced from physical reality helped pave the way for our modern emphasis on emotional intimacy within relationships. Then there's the enduring concept of chivalry, which, while not exclusively about sex, certainly influenced perceptions of male-female interactions. The idea of the knight as protector, the defender of women, however idealized or hypocritical it often was in practice, shaped societal expectations of male behavior within courtship and marriage. This legacy continues to subtly influence our ideas of gentlemanly conduct, even if the dragons and damsels are long gone. It's a quirky tidbit to think about how much of our romantic vocabulary is steeped in these ancient, often contradictory, ideals. Historians still argue about the precise moment when the idea of companionate marriage, based on affection and mutual respect, began to emerge. Was it a gradual shift, a slow erosion of purely economic unions, or were there specific cultural turning points? What is clear is that the medieval period, with its complex interplay of religious doctrine, social hierarchy, and human desire, formed the crucible in which many of these modern ideas began to simmer. The very tension between the Church's strictures and humanity's inherent urges created a dynamic that, over centuries, led to new ways of thinking about love, sex, and partnership. So, while you might not have survived the literal realities of medieval intimacy, the smells, the diseases, the lack of privacy, you are, in a very real sense, a product of its complex evolution. The desire for connection, the struggle for autonomy over one's body, the societal attempts to regulate intimacy, and the yearning for something beyond mere procreation, these were all present, in their own challenging ways. In the Middle Ages, they are threads that weave through history, connecting your modern experience of love and relationships to a past that was far more messy, dangerous, and fascinating than the fairy tales often suggest. The world you inhabit, with its emphasis on individual choice and romantic love, is a distant, yet discernible, descendant of that muddy, often brutal, medieval landscape.